Hey, welcome to Sleepy Vlog 77.5, the second half of my Q&A, I guess. I have switched from beer to tea. Surprisingly, that beer just went to my head today in a way, and I just feel like I need to level out with some tea. I'm not drinking Earl Grey. It is Awake English Breakfast. So it is Tazo Tea's most caffeinated tea. I don't know if Tazo is a national chain in the United States, I assume. Anyway, and I put soy milk in it, so I guess that makes me a soy boy. A horrible thing to be, apparently. I'm also going to eat some chocolate. So, as another public service, another good thing I got from Kickstarter actually just recently is this God Hates Astronauts special 3D Cowboys 2D Spectacular, which is a bunch of short stories, I believe, because I just got it yesterday. Written by Ryan Brown, the creator of God Loves Astronauts, but mostly drawn by a bunch of interesting and some very top-level comic book guest artists. So he's got Paulo Rivera, James Herron, Greg Smallwood, Andy McDonald, I don't know him, Ryan Lee, Rob Guillory, Chris Burnham, Xander Cannon, Buster Moody, I don't know him, Robert Wilson IV, I'm not sure if I know who that is, and Joe Quinones, all doing some guest art in here. So I heard about this on a podcast and ordered it, and it came through quite quickly. It is in color. I'm not going to switch up to color, but since this podcast, this vlog number 77 is all about showing you what can't be shown, I did discover there's a page here where you get some hoo-ha action. You got King Dong and you got Junk blocking out this guy's naked personal junk. So I guess he knows the polite way to do it in this comic compared to that Batman comic that I showed at the beginning of Sleepy Vlog 77. So if you missed that and you want to see Batman's little Bruce, it might be worth watching that really long vlog just at the beginning, and then you can turn it off. You don't have to watch the whole thing, where I spent most of my time answering a lot of questions, and I'm going to continue doing that. So you can start here, or you could go back to Sleepy Vlog, the first half. It really doesn't matter. So the question I was up to was from Special Person. These are all questions that were asked because I requested questions at the end of Sleepy Vlog 76, and I'm sort of reading some questions and some comments from that Sleepy Vlog, and I plan to continue to answer questions and just respond to comments more on a more frequent basis with more frequent Sleepy Vlogs. For those of you who can stand it. I need more tea. That's hot. Special Person asked, here's a question. Should the direct market be put to rest? And this is a topic that seems to be coming up a lot. Is the direct market viable anymore? Is it going under? The direct market meaning comic book stores. And it's called the direct market because they were originally sold comics directly from the comic book publishers rather than going through a wholesaler who used to sell. The wholesalers would sell to news magazines and they had to return them. In the direct market, originally, the comic book stores bought directly from the comic book companies, and however many comics they bought, they were stuck with. If you bought 100 comics, you had to try to sell those 100 comics. And the comic book companies didn't have to take them back, so it was an enormous savings to the publisher, a huge savings, because it used to be that a 50% return rate was a really good one. Some comics had a 70% return rate. So you can just imagine how expensive that is to trash 70% of what you're publishing to sell 30%. And then it has evolved. So there is a middleman called Diamond Distributors, but it's still this non-returnable basis. And presumably comic book stores still get a better discount on what they buy than if they did it on a returnable basis, the way, say, bookstores do it. I don't really know. But it seemed to evolve into a place that just sells comics to people who are already hardcore comic fans. And without the newsstand and the old ways of distribution, you're not creating much of a new audience. Although I don't know if that's totally true. But anyway, it's a much smaller niche kind of market than it was back in the days of newsstands. But for a long time, it was, especially when it first came out and newsstands were kind of dying and being hurt by the mob and all kinds of things, it was a much more economically viable place for comics. And now there's digital, there's the graphic novel market. I think that's about it. But those are big, especially the graphic novel market. And it seems like maybe you can just bypass the comic book store market. And it seems like the comic book store market keeps going down. Although I think if you really looked at it, it's been going up and down for a while. And it's not as far down as it was in, say, the late 90s, early 2000s. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my impression. And I suppose some people think that's where the creepy dudes hang out and we don't need them or something. But I don't think that's the basis of the question. I certainly think if the direct market went away, if comic book shops went away, comics would continue now because we have the digital and we have a very large graphic novel market. And that is where the generation of my daughter's generation are getting their comics. They're reading lots more graphic novels than any previous generation. And they find them at the library and in their school. If their teacher isn't prejudiced against graphic novels, they find them in their classroom. I don't think it should go away. I think it's an amazing market for any publisher where every copy you sell is non-returnable, so you have this base upon which to sell. B, the monthly quality where you can make some money every month. Publishing is very hard because, like with a novel, some novelists might take 2 years to write a novel. The publisher gives them an advance if they're an established novelist, and it might be 3 years before the book comes out. Like they might get the novel in 2 years, and then the process of publishing novels seems to be a long one. So it might be 3 years before the novel actually comes out. Whereas with a comic book, they're paying the artist and the writer this month, and by next month they've got all the profits from that comic. Now the profits are much smaller, but I think it's still significant and keeps things going. And because of that, I think you can try more things, even though you can look at comics in one way and say, well, they're very conservative. If you look at them in another way, they're trying a lot more new things than your average publisher of novels is trying so I feel like it's a hothouse of evolution of comics in a way that you wouldn't get without it. I wouldn't want to get rid of the graphic novel market or the digital market either. So inevitably the direct market's only going to be a portion of things, but I think it still could be the engine that drives creativity and experimentation and tries out new things, try out new creators and the like. The model where you give someone an advance and wait a few years and then publish it is inherently conservative. You've got to be, as a publisher, you're taking a much bigger risk if it doesn't sell. And the tendency is to be more conservative, and I think the writers tend to be more conservative, say in the novel market, where they publish endless reiterations of the same novel. And granted, Marvel and DC are publishing endless reiterations, but a lot of writers out there are trying, in Image Comics and Aftershock and all these other things, they're trying things they haven't done before, or wild variations on things that you get a lot less in the prose world, the novel model. So I worry about that model taking over all comics, and there'd be a much slower evolution, I think, of comics, and maybe a lot more losers, a lot less space for little niche people to survive. So I don't think the direct market should be put to rest. Can it be improved? Definitely. Do we have to kind of... I think the publishers have to change their model, and even if something is not making them a lot of money in the direct market, and we see some of this, like Squirrel Girl does not make Marvel a lot of money in the direct market, but it makes them a lot of money. So they have to view the direct market as this hothouse experimentation place and not stress too much when they don't make as much money in the direct market. And they probably aren't as they make more money in the book market. But they shouldn't make the mistake of thinking they can do without the direct market, is my point. And I went on too long. No wonder these videos are way longer than I planned. Hellspawn says, if you're comfortable doing so, could you recommend a good Harlan Ellison short story? I'm interested, but I'm not a good reader. Thanks. Well, in that sense, you're in luck, because Harlan Ellison's best work is all quite short. So if you don't have to read a huge amount of material, I guess you have to find those particular short stories. The one I would recommend is I Have No Mouth, Yet I Must Scream. That's one of his big award-winning stories, so it's probably been reprinted in a lot of places. I don't, off the top of my head, know the name of the main collection it came out in. But with Google and everything, you could find that. I Have No Mouth, Yet I Must Scream. Another favorite of mine was called Hitler Painted Roses. So that's a cool one. You can also, if you can find like an old paperback collection of his, maybe anything from 1980 or earlier, used copy, and just flip through it and just try a story here or there. The cool thing about Harlan Ellison, and this was his old school way of promoting himself, is in a lot of his collections, every story had an introduction where he told you, some interesting detail about the writing of this story, which made you more interested in the story. So I would almost go back and just read Harlan Ellison introductions to his stories more than his stories. Silent Stag asked, are you drinking iced milk? I don't think he intended that as a real question for this Q&A vlog, but I was drinking iced chai, or not chai, actually. I think it was kind of the greenish stuff. It was this, it's like those chai lattes, but it's made with matcha green tea. And I was quite an addict of matcha green tea, especially in a sweetened latte kind of mix. So I bought the mix myself and made it at home and put it over ice rather than steaming it or whatever you're supposed to do. Chris Rush says, how do you approach different eras of comics? I love silly Silver Age books, but would not spend $4 on one today. I assume he meant he would not spend $4 on a comic book today, or maybe did Chris mean he would not spend $4 on a silly Silver Age book? I tend to spend around $3 to $6 on the sillier Silver Age, DC Silver Age books I get. If they're more expensive, I don't get them. But like the Lois Lane and the Jimmy Olsen and some of this early Silver Age Superman has some amazing goofy stuff in it. I also read some of those digitally, or on Comixology or Hoopla. But spending $4 on the modern comics, now a $4 comic cost me $3 with my discount. If they and when I'm actually paying $4, I feel very reluctant, but I still do it sometimes. But anyway, and when he says categorize different eras of comics, so I think of Silver Age, and I think of the very early Bronze Age as part of the Silver Age, to be honest. So maybe the Bronze Age for me begins around 73, 74, when you get a shift away from that Stan Lee, Roy Thomas storytelling, and you're getting more of the Steve Gerber, Doug Mensch, and some other, Don McGregor, and some other people who were being more experimental and a little more serious. Even Steve Gerber's goofy, but he's more serious in intent in a way. So the innocence has worn off a little further. And then, it would be nice to have people talk about the Dark Age, and I really don't like that categorization. But sometime in the early 80s, things really changed, I think, starting with the influence of... am I getting caught in my shirt? Starting with the influence of Frank Miller's Daredevil and going forward, things got a little more... I don't know, the tone changed. Darker isn't entirely the right thing. There was a different emotional tone to things. And at the same time, you had the whole Jim Shooter influence where he tried to make people do small panels, and in a way he was less into flashy art or something like that. I'm not quite sure how to put that into words. And then I feel like the 90s should get its own category too. And then it feels like maybe starting with Marvel's Ultimate series. I know those were all based on the Authority, but to me that's where it really took off, kind of the Ultimate Comics, which eventually the way they did the Marvel's Ultimate Universe is the way they just did their regular universe too. And at the same time, we see DC kind of reabsorbing a lot of the literary things from Vertigo, which culminated in the New 52, where they actually, some of the books that were part of the New 52 felt like they ought to be part of Vertigo. And meanwhile, Vertigo kind of died on the vine. But where we are now, so I don't have names for those ages, but that's kind of the way I think of it. Where we are now, I don't know, but, and then we also at the same time so it culminated with Marvel and DC bringing in these more slightly indie kind of features. And then we see the writers who did that kind of stuff exploding back out into Image. So I think right now we're in what I think of as the Image era, the second Image era of the creator-owned, writer-driven, creator-owned kind of explosion of... in a sense, it's a bit of a mirror to Vertigo, but it feels different to me because it's a bigger explosion than Vertigo, and it goes along with the feeling that all the best work is being done outside of Marvel and DC. If any of that makes sense. So he was saying, I love silly Silver Age books, but would not spend $4 on one today. What does it mean if I enjoy a comic more than one that is not as well made or profound? Can you compare comics from different eras? I understand what you mean, but I don't know how to put my finger on that either, because I can enjoy what I used to think of as, like, say, a really bad Lois Lane comic. On some level, it's really bad, but on some level, it's a wonderful reading experience to me now, particularly if I'm reading it out loud, which is usually to my daughter. But at the same time, the Marvel comics at the same time were a different reading experience, which had a much different emotional tone and felt like you were part of the club rather than an observer from outside. And then I feel like, starting with Frank Miller, you were drawn into a wild emotional roller coaster ride in a way that maybe you didn't get so much, especially if you were already an older reader, from the comics of early eras. That's another one that it would be great to circle back to after I've thought about it some more, maybe in a future blog. The talking about the different eras and what their characteristics were. Gore Vidal says, as to questions, if anyone asks a personal one, just refer them, like I do, to your attorney, or mine at Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Okay. Boy, wouldn't it be wonderful to have attorneys who can answer all questions for you? Gore says, I enjoyed your thoughts on the passing of Harlan Ellison. I remember you talking about the unpleasant meeting experience. I can see how they make you think twice about reading him again. Harlan, like Gore, and I think he means the real Gore Vidal, who was a famous writer mostly in the 70s, I would say, understood the power of television, maybe the 70s and 60s and beyond, and used it to promote himself and Norman Mailer. Remember his book, Advertisements for Myself. And that's, back then, Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer and a bunch of other writers would actually appear on shows like The Tonight Show and stuff, which you don't really see that kind of thing anymore. I'm still taken by his stories. I think he's talking about Harlan Ellison. I think Michael Moorcock is one of the few writers from the New Wave that's still alive. The New Wave is the science fiction New Wave, which is what he's referring to. Yeah, I can't think of who else is alive from the New Wave. That generation's kind of passing. There probably are a few others. I don't know. Is Norman Spinrad still alive? I don't know if he's passed. Yeah. The New Wave started in England in a British magazine called New Worlds and kind of caught fire and was very controversial in the science fiction world. It was the 60s and 70s Young Turks, supposedly bringing in literary values to comics. But they were bringing in certain literary values and certain hippie values, I would say. And then he asks, how is the remastered Cerebus different than the earlier phone books? And I don't have to answer that question because Jared Osborne answers that question. Remastered Cerebus is only different in that they could no longer be printed without being digital. Sim had to have all the old film that was stored digitized, since printers no longer make printing plates from film. So all those thousands of Cerebus pages on film had to be scanned in and cleaned up. Plus, there were pages missing. He also had to put out a call to fans who may have had his original art to have the pages scanned in. Still, there were pages missing that had to be scanned from printed copies and reconstructed. I also don't think his production guy knew what he was doing when he started. Few do. So it took a while to get done. So that's a great answer. Thank you so much, Jared. There's all this stuff in the background that, only people like Jared understand all this work that goes into it because he worked in comics production. I got a hint of it at the Jim Starlin panel. Before the panel officially started, Jim was already taking questions from the audience, and I asked about whether he would be returning to Dreadstar. And the answer I got wasn't quite what I wanted, but he's been returning to Dreadstar to fix the coloring in 1,200 pages of it because it's going to be reprinted again. And I guess a lot of it or all of it was not shot on, not done digitally, and so maybe they've had to scan it. And he says a lot of the coloring back then was done very sloppily, and so he's going through and adjusting the color on a few pages every day, and he was getting really sick of Dreadstar doing that for 1,100 pages. But I look forward to Dreadstar being reprinted in some really nice edition. That'll be cool. The chocolate I've been eating is this kind of chocolate. I'm not sure what the brand is, but it tastes good. I don't know if the rest is just some comments that I copied down because I thought I would read them out, or whether there's questions buried in here. Russ Work says, because I talked about Harlan Ellison being the main science fiction guy who was publicly a comics fan, and then I thought, well, maybe Ray Bradbury was too. But I didn't think he was as involved as Harlan, but maybe I was wrong on that. Russ Work says, Bradbury was a comics fan from childhood and never gave it up, but it was mostly the stuff of his early years, like Buck Rogers and Prince Valiant. I remember a book called Ray Bradbury: An Illustrated Life, in which he talks about his interest and involvement in illustration and comics related to his work. Bradbury promoted Hans Bach, and I wonder if Hans was one of his friends from his fandom days, who was a fan artist at the time. Oh, yeah. And Hans Bach eventually was a professional artist. I remember covers by him and stuff. He had a very unique style, and I think for a while was very popular in the pulp science fiction magazines and maybe fantasy magazines. Bradbury promoted Hans Bach, who was a fan artist at the time, to the SF magazines he was just starting to sell to. There's a great anecdote in a documentary about Ray Harryhausen, who is the famous stop-motion guy who did, like, the Jason and the Argonauts movie, amongst others. There's a great anecdote in a documentary about Ray Harryhausen, and I think I saw it on YouTube. When Harryhausen got his first Oscar, Bradbury contrived to be the presenter, and he told the touching story of how the two of them made a pact as kids to never grow up. And Harryhausen spent his life playing with monster and dinosaur models, while Bradbury basically was paid to dream all day. I think his love of comics was tied with his determination to avoid becoming an adult. What does that say about all of us? Are we the same? I feel very adult. 64-page special. One of my favorite commenters, favorite YouTubers, says, "Ooh, I've got a question. Do you watch Dave Sim at 2 times speed? He talks a little slow." Yeah, I would. So Dave Sim does a weekly vlog, and I watch sometimes, but I get very impatient. He takes a long time to get to the point. It's kind of funny because I remember thinking of him, back in the day when I'd see pictures of him and see what he was writing about things as a young iconoclast. And now he just seems like an old fogey puttering around his house and putting out a vlog every now and then about, yeah, we're reprinting one of my old stories and I'm working on my arthritis or something like that. Not that that's exactly what he says, but so that's kind of funny. And my final commenter, the well-esteemed Masked Panther, who's considering becoming the Unmasked Panther. At least I'm promoting that name. He says, "I'm still waiting for you to talk about Mr. Miracle by Kirby. I finally finished that run, and I think hearing your opinions and thoughts on it would make me see the series from a different point of view." So, the problem is, as I think I answered him in the comments, is I've never completely reread Mr. Miracle, and I probably didn't read all the issues in a row back in the 70s when I first read them as a kid. And I recall there was a point where suddenly the whole direction of Mr. Miracle changed when they canceled all the Fourth World books except Mr. Miracle and told Kirby not to set Mr. Miracle in the Fourth World. And then they brought in that young kid to kind of become his assistant. I can't remember that kid's name, but eventually Grant Morrison turned him into Mr. Miracle. So I want to reread them someday, but I have a lot of different things I want to reread Masked Panther, so I'm not sure when I will do that. The main thing to keep in mind of Mr. Miracle is, in a way, it's a secondary book to the central book, which is New Gods. Mr. Miracle is a very important character because he is, and I don't know how clearly that is revealed in the Mr. Miracle comics, he is actually the son of Isaiah, who's the High Father of the New Gods, the good New Gods who live on New Genesis. And Isaiah and Darkseid made a pact where they traded sons. So in a way, Mr. Miracle is the son of God sent to be raised in hell, which is an interesting subtext to everything that's going on in there. And so I love the issues where he and Barda go back to Apocalypse. I can't remember the reason why they go back to Apocalypse, so that shows you how much I've lacked in my reading there. So in a way, and then the whole New God story never got properly finished. I mean, later they paid Kirby to write a graphic novel, which it was so many years later, it's not really the same thing anymore. So he did kind of complete it. But so Mr. Miracle is part of this tapestry, but it was an unfinished tapestry too. So it's a difficult book to completely put into context. I think the idea of, supposedly the escape artist thing came from Jim Steranko, who was an escape artist. But I think it also just plays into the whole idea of being Jewish and the Holocaust and having fought in World War II and all just being a survivor. And so if you do read The Mr. Miracle by Tom King eventually, clearly Tom King is going for those underlying themes and bringing them up and kind of taking away the superhero aspect of it, making it into more like an indie comic about the domestic life of someone in this situation almost, if that makes sense, and the neurosis and psychosis of it all. But I think all of that, and Mr. Miracle's kind of running away again, in a sense, from the bigger conflict. He's on the side of the bigger conflict. So I don't know if that's kind of the stuff that affected you when you read Mr. Miracle. I need to go back and see if you ever summed up your thoughts on the whole Mr. Miracle series yourself. I remember you talking about certain issues. So anyway, that is all the questions. I have to confess that, that first video that was 50 minutes long, I recorded it twice before. And the first time I recorded it, I included all this other vloggy kind of material. And I got halfway through the questions and I was like, oh no, this is way too long. I'll start over and I'll do less. I won't put in all the other material about books I've gotten and stuff. And it still went 50 minutes. So then I did it a third time and I even cut even more out and got quicker to the questions. And I still went 50 minutes. There's something wrong with me. 50 minutes is way too long for a video. This one is now run 33 minutes, so I'm going to cut it off in a second. But yeah, I talk too much. I don't know what it is. I do not know what it is. I will be back in a week with another Sleepy Vlog. I'll probably be back with some other videos in the meantime, comic book thoughts. But in 6 to 8 days, I'll be back with another Sleepy Vlog, especially if I've gotten any more questions. But I have some other things to say too, whether or not I get questions and comments. But like I said, I plan to make everything more interactive. So I'll talk to you all very soon.